Wartime Japan, unveiling the roots of brutality. In the modern mind, Japan evokes images of vibrant anime, refined culinary arts, and the majestic sport of sumo. People often associate it with Godzilla, impeccable politeness, and cutting-edge technological innovation. However, looking back at the last century, the land of the rising sun presented a starkly different facade, a hauntingly dark reputation. So, what precisely shaped Japan's notorious brutality during World War II? The specter of Bushido. To truly grasp this, we must journey back centuries. Feudal Japan was a fragmented tapestry of constantly warring minor states, reaching its zenith during the Sengoku Jidai period, mid-15th century to 1603. These endless conflicts propelled the warrior class, the samurai, to a paramount position in the culture. When the Tokugawa shogunate brought stability, this warrior spirit was formalized into a strict moral code of conduct known as Bushido, or the Way of the Warrior. While Bushido underwent adjustments over time, its core tenets, self-sacrifice, reckless bravery in the face of danger, and absolute loyalty to one's lord, remained unwavering. After the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the era of the samurai ended, rigid social classes were abolished, and Japan underwent rapid industrialization after centuries of isolation. Bushido, in this new context, was adapted for modern purposes. The emperor and military officers became the new archetypes, replacing the shogun and daimyo, and its doctrines dominated actions leading up to and during World War II. The Japanese education system of that era deeply ingrained the disciplined militarism of Bushido. Students were indoctrinated into a rigid system of unwavering discipline, where absolute obedience to authority was celebrated as the highest virtue. This ruthless enforcement was demonstrated through cruel punishments, being beaten by teachers with sticks or wooden swords, being forced to run until exhaustion, or having to hold heavy objects with outstretched hands. This method of indoctrination cultivated a generation fiercely loyal to their emperor and superiors, ready to obey without question. The no retreat, no surrender ethos. Perhaps the most haunting characteristic of Japanese culture during this period was the unyielding determination to fight to the bitter end. The concept of surrender was considered an unbearable disgrace, a mark of shame for any fighting man. While other armies might recognize the futility of continued combat and lay down their arms, the Japanese military steadfastly fought on, regardless of casualties. To illustrate the extent of this fanaticism, for every 3 Allied soldiers captured in World War II, 1 was killed on the battlefield, whereas for the Japanese military, 120 lives were lost for every single soldier taken captive. They even engaged in banzai attacks, charging directly into the enemy instead of accepting defeat. This term originated from their battle cry, Tenno Heika Banzai, long live the emperor. A prime example is the banzai charge on July 6, 1944 on Saipan. After 3 weeks of fierce fighting, American forces controlled most of the island and were tightening their noose around the remaining Japanese defenders. Rather than surrender, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu, the commanding officer, chose to perform seppuku, the honorable ritual suicide of the samurai. Following this, the remaining soldiers and officers, along with many civilians, desperately hurled themselves at American lines, hoping to inflict maximum damage before falling. The ensuing chaotic combat lasted 12 hours, much of it desperate hand-to-hand fighting. An estimated 4,300 Japanese soldiers chose death in this manner rather than surrender. This was the largest banzai attack of World War II. This unyielding, almost fanatical spirit was not confined to the military. Hundreds of civilians also threw themselves off cliff sides to avoid capture by the horrified Americans. While the Saipan attack was the largest, banzai charges continued throughout the island-hopping campaign. Any survivors often performed seppuku. Furthermore, many Japanese soldiers would feign surrender only to unexpectedly throw a grenade or draw a pistol on unsuspecting American soldiers. After numerous such incidents, American forces gradually ceased trusting surrender attempts, often simply shooting the supposed surrendering soldier to avoid risk. The ultimate manifestation of this never-surrender attitude was the Kamikaze, meaning divine wind. These were suicide pilots who intentionally crashed their planes into enemy ships in a last-ditch, desperate attempt to halt the relentless Allied advance toward the Japanese homeland. These pilots were sent on one-way missions, aiming to inflict maximum damage on enemy naval forces. Kamikaze attacks peaked in 1945 during the Battle of Okinawa, the last stepping stone before Japan itself. Swarms of these fanatical pilots assaulted the American fleet, causing over 5,000 deaths, the U.S. Navy's greatest loss of life in a single battle. Even as their Pacific empire crumbled, the Japanese nation refused to yield. Reports indicate they even distributed bamboo spears to school children in preparation for a total resistance. When planning Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, the American military anticipated having to fight the majority of the population. Estimates for potential Allied casualties reached as high as 1 million, and 500,000 Purple Hearts were produced. A number so vast that these original medals are still being awarded today. Contempt for prisoners of war. Because the concept of surrender was unfathomable to the Japanese military mindset, they held utter contempt for enemy combatants who laid down their weapons. These individuals, in the eyes of the Japanese, had forfeited their honor, and in an honor-bound society, they were considered the lowest of the low. Further compounding this was Japan's disregard for the Geneva Convention, which governed the treatment of prisoners of war. Although Japan had signed the convention, it failed to ratify it, and as a result, they did not abide by its tenets. Some officers derisively referred to it as the Coward's Code. Consequently, when Allied troops surrendered, such as the 80,000 British, Indian, Malaysian, and Australian soldiers at the fall of Singapore in 1942, the Japanese were taken aback. How could any self-respecting fighting man give up so easily? Lacking honor in their eyes, prisoners were treated like animals, with little regard for their well-being. They were subjected to forced hard labor, deliberately starved, beaten, and executed for the slightest infractions. They could be used for bayonet practice or summarily decapitated with an officer's sword. The consequence of this treatment was an appallingly high death rate among prisoners of war in Japanese custody. In comparison, the death rate for an Allied soldier in a German POW camp was approximately 1.2%, while those unfortunate enough to be captured by the enemy Japanese suffered a death rate as high as 37%. Inhumanity towards civilians. This blatant disregard for human life was not limited to military personnel, but also extended to civilians. Beyond the influence of Bushido, the Japanese also harbored deeply xenophobic views towards outsiders, especially the Chinese. As early as 1931, Japan began encroaching on Chinese territory, which erupted into the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. In December of that year, the Japanese army captured the city of Nanjing. Over the next 2 months, the city's population was systematically subjected to one of history's most brutal sackings. Estimates vary, but between 100,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians were killed, with countless incidents of torture, sexual assault, and murder. Horrifyingly, at one point, a pair of Japanese officers even competed to see who could decapitate 100 Chinese people the fastest, both exceeding the number by murdering 106 and 105 individuals, respectively. However, by far the most chilling aspect of this disregard for human life was Unit 731, a chemical and biological warfare research team of the Imperial Japanese Army. This unit conducted barbaric experiments on captive prisoners, primarily Chinese and Korean subjects. Prisoners were infected with various diseases for scientists to document the disease's progression. Limbs were hacked off and organs removed while the victim was still alive to determine disease progression in living tissue. Weapons were also tested on living subjects, including guns, knives, bayonets, explosives like grenades, flamethrowers, and anything else in the Japanese arsenal, with their effectiveness meticulously noted for study. These are just a few of the horrors Unit 731 inflicted on the defenseless. After the war, the Japanese government and people made every effort to distance themselves from the fanaticism of the mid-20th century, even enshrining pacifism in their constitution. Japanese culture has undergone a complete transformation, now focusing much more intensely on technological advancement and connection with the outside world. A 180-degree shift from their violent past. What do you think is the most significant lesson the world can learn from the dark aspects of Japan's wartime history?